joined by two fantastic speakers to kick us off and delve into that in more. I'll go first to Steve Chinnery, who's Digital Sustainability Product Strategist at DWP Digital. He brings over 30 years of experience in financial services, where he held senior roles spanning strategy, experience design, business improvement and transformation. But driven by a desire to pursue a more purposeful path, Steve has recently transitioned to focus on sustainability and climate change in his career. I'll then hand over to Mark Butcher, the Director of Positive Cloud Limited. They're a company dedicated to pioneering green ops, FinOps and DevOps across IT, from data centres and infrastructure to end-user devices, cloud services and software development, with a particular focus on helping public and private sector organisations modernise their IT services. Mark brings extensive experience in guiding organisations towards ambitious net zero targets and reducing their digital carbon emissions. So we'll hear first from Steve, then from Mark. We'll have a bit of a conversation on the panel. And then again, we'll come out to you in the audience for questions. We'll do that with mics, but do also use the Slido. Again, that's slido.com. And the code is 2707854. Steve.
Thank you. I feel a little bit like the hors d'oeuvre before the main event, sitting next to Mark on the stage, because I know how good Mark is on this subject. So I guess I just want to position this as a bit of a paradox that we've got going on at the moment. So on the one hand, you've got institutions like the World Economic Forum saying that kind of 4 out of the 5 top risks that organisations are facing into over the next 5 to 10 years are environmental. And you've got Deloitte kind of saying 70% of organisations, public and private, predicting over the next 3 years, climate change and kind of environmental related kind of issues are going to significantly impact their businesses. So big thing. But then on the other side of it, you've got organisations, and you've seen it in the press recently, rowing back from commitments to sustainability. And you've also got this kind of continuing kind of drip of it's difficult to get sustainability embedded outside of the bubble. And I guess the fact that you guys are here, you're probably in or kind of trying to get into the sustainability bubble. What about what's happening outside of that? How do we make sustainability a bit more mainstream? So this is less about the technology associated with this. It's about how do we get sustainability into the kind of ways of working, a bit like I guess we've successfully been able to do with things like accessibility and disability, where those things now are kind of seen as being fairly, it's the way we do things around here. And I'm not sure that sustainability yet is in that space.
Great, thank you. Welcome.
That's about right. So I think the problem broadly with it is sustainability has existed in a bubble for too long, and it's become a byword for costing more. And actually, perversely, the reverse is true. If you take the word sustainability and replace it with efficiency, you're talking about pretty much the same thing. It's about making sensible, grown-up decisions and actually executing on them. And part of the challenge, as I think you said there, is we're seeing a lot of the rowing back because it's the inconvenient truth that when a lot of organisations made net zero pledges, they didn't have a clue what they were talking about. So they made virtue signalling promises sitting in boardrooms where they all argued with each other about the target they were going to set. And I can say this with some clarity because during the period of COVID, I ended up somehow becoming a local councillor. And I don't know how anyone voted for me, by the way. But somehow it happened. And I sat in our meetings where we discussed the dates. And the dates they were basically decided by a bunch of people trying to outperform each other. So there was performative date setting with 2040, that's not enough. 2035, yeah, well, let's go for that. And someone else says, no, 2030, that's what we should go for. With no understanding of how they were going to do it or what the impact would be. Without even understanding the calculations they were talking about or the data points they'd need to measure. And what that ends up with is you end up then, when that date suddenly becomes real, which a lot of them now are, they're now close enough for people to go, oh God, no, because my pay is now tied to the execution of that thing. And that's the separation we're seeing right now. It's a separation between execs are basically going, I don't want my pay now to be tied to the thing that I know I'm not going to do. So they're trying to separate it out. So a lot of the problems we're seeing here is this. So sustainability in tech is not a technology problem per se at all. It's a people problem, it's a culture problem, and it's absolutely a leadership ownership issue here. Because what we see is the same thing happening time and time again. And this is across public and private sector, so this is not universal within the public sector. It's the problem is leaders need to take accountability and they need to own the problem they're trying to solve. And what I see is a tendency for accountability to be pushed downwards. What happens is without accountability, no execution happens, because the reality is sustainability in tech actually saves you an awful lot of money if you do it properly. It enables you to operate all the things, all the buzzwords we all say already. So efficient, well-optimized, well-run services, guess what? Those mostly are going to be way more sustainable than what's done today. And I think the one thing I often talk about is very secretly, I think most people, I'm going to avoid massive sweeping statements here, most people don't really care about saving money as such in reality, because they know the budget can be found somewhere to do a thing. But actually, if you find something that people care about implicitly, which generally the environment is something that enough people care about to want to use it as a metric, if you tie that to understanding the efficiency of what you have, guess what happens is people end up consuming resources more efficiently. They make the different decisions, which then aligns very nicely into exactly what kind of Tom was talking about. Because if you did sort of a Venn diagram of all of the slides that were up there of all these interlinking things, you'll find they all massively overlap in every single area where nothing changes if people don't understand the impact of their actions. To understand the impact of their actions, they need to have principles they can work to. But the key thing is those principles need to be tied to actually the leadership right at the top, giving people the time, the budget and the resource to implement the changes that are required to make the better decisions.
Great, thank you. So you've already started to head towards this, but what do we do about all of those problems? Should we start with the leadership sort of question? You're talking a bit about tying people to pay and what else? What are the other changes that we need to see?
Mess with their wallet. That's it. Every time, if you mess with exec leaders' pay, things get done. It's kind of as simple as that. And part of that links into giving people at all levels targets that they can actually see their impact upon. Because there's no point giving someone an abstract target. And what often happens in sustainability is we talk about tons of things. So as in tons of carbon here, tons of this, and that is really abstract for the average person and the average team at every single level because they don't see how they personally are accountable and can influence it. And one of the things in sustainability is the perfect example of the butterfly effect. All these little ripples everywhere have a gigantic impact when you stitch them all together. All these little decisions. People always go, I'm one person, I'm irrelevant. You're developing this application that's going to be used by 30 million users. Guess what? A 5% increase in efficiency in that application has a mammoth impact to emissions down the track.
Yeah, and just taking that on a little bit further, there's a quote I like, which is, it's really hard to get somebody to believe in something if they also believe that their salary is dependent on them not believing it. Yeah. So if you think that being sustainable is going to make your job as a project manager or a coder more expensive, take longer, be more complex, mean that you might not end up hitting the deadlines and targets that you've got, then it's a really, really difficult sell. And I think that sustainability, to Mark's point, has got a bit of it's not another thing that I have to worry about on top of all of the other things that I've got to worry about. I've yet to meet a project manager who's not telling me that they've got more than enough things to worry about. Thank you very much. Please don't give me something more to get on with. So trying to eke out the kind of co-benefits of this, and Mark's point about replacing the word sustainability with efficiency or effectiveness becomes really quite important. From a personal view, I'm not really bothered what we call this. What I am bothered about is getting some proper results out the back of it. And I think that the danger is that sustainability exists in a bit of a bubble at the moment. I'm old enough to remember, I don't know whether anybody else has that kind of TV show, horrible TV show, Stars in Your Eyes, where you used to go onto the stage and I'd be dressed up as, I don't know, David Bowie, and do my bit so on sustainability. And then I'll take the hat off and the next day I'll go back to being Steve Chinnery and being a project manager and what's this sustainability rubbish that's trying to stop me from kind of doing what I'm supposed to be doing. We've got to be better than that. Sustainability professionals, we've got to be better than that. We've got to take sustainability to the work and not expect the work to come to sustainability.
Thank you. Have you seen any good examples of teams, organisations being able to do that? Are there places we should all be looking to see where some of those problems have been solved?
I'm not going to ruin one of the presentations from later.
I was going to say the same.
Yeah. So yes, there are really good examples, and you are going to hear one of them in I think one of the panels that follows this. So we're not going to blow that one, otherwise I'll get absolutely shot. But there's good examples happening across government bodies and also into the private sector where people are now trying to make the genuinely better decisions. And the challenge is it requires that investment in the time from leadership to let them actually execute upon them. And a lot of this is actually making the decisions you already know you should be making. And it's also making those decisions that you already say you make, but you don't actually make. If I take the example of refurbished devices, it's an excellent example. Everyone says they have a target for buying refurbished devices all the time. They say 20% minimum, that kind of thing. You see that often. And then you go and ask them how many they buy, and the figure is normally 0%. So it's a simple thing, is you've got a thing, you know you can buy them. And part of this is also about the vendor community coming together on this as well, because the vendors need to be more proactive in helping to push this as a narrative that they support. Because often the primary motivator for them is selling the net new things to reach their sales targets. So actually they need to come together and help actually support the way that you need to buy things in a more sustainable manner. And then that links back into the policies that you have around the way you buy things as well. So being more sustainable in the way things are procured as well, looking at the individual types of assets, which requires you to intend as an RFPs to balance your metrics, not so much focused towards purely the cost, but also balancing it more towards the sustainability of the product. Not necessarily the corporation you're buying from, but the product you're buying from the corporation, which requires you to have the metrics, the numbers and the data to support those decisions. Because one thing we have in tech is being obsessed by numbers in tech means that people often, if you give them bad data, they just will not make the decisions. If they don't trust the data you're giving them, they will ignore that decision all day long while smiling politely at you. So it's about bringing it all together.
We've talked about leadership quite a bit, but we've also touched a little bit on what all of us can do. So what can each one of us do in our sort of roles? How can we think about asking the right questions of leadership, asking the right questions about accountability and scrutiny, asking the right questions about culture and helping to shift those things ourselves within our organisations?
Well, I'll start. So capability is right at the heart of this. When most of the staff surveys across government and indeed other organisations, colleagues are saying, yeah, we want to be sustainable, but don't always know how to go about doing it. So we've got to start giving colleagues the tools to be able to do that. And part of this, and I know it's something we've been talking about in the cross-government working groups, is getting some core capability out there. It's something that we've done in DWP. We've got some awareness courses and we're developing more this year to try and help colleagues kind of understand the mechanics of this. I think the other thing, though, is having case studies. So part of the challenge, I think, at the moment is there's a little bit of taking some of this stuff on belief. Yeah, we think that this is the right thing to do. This sounds like the right thing to do. We've got to move beyond that and actually get some really good case studies. And as Mark's mentioned, you're going to see one later on today of where sustainability, actually, some projects have delivered some sustainable benefits, but they've also delivered co-benefits as well. I can't stress enough, sustainability does not exist in its own little bubble. It exists as part of an ecosystem of the organisation. So we've got kind of within government, we've got citizens that we've got to deliver services for. We've got budgets that we've got to kind of work within. We've got strategic kind of objectives that we've got to hit. So thinking about sustainability outside of all of those things, I think is a bit of a false errand. We've got to try and combine these bits together and we've got to use the kind of case studies that we're developing, get those documented and then shout about it. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago and asked a similar kind of question. And the most important thing they said is talk about it, shout about it, talk about what you're doing. And be curious about trying to find out what other people are doing. We've got to make that easier.
Yeah, I would. Yes, I completely agree with that. And a lot of this is the challenge the data you're given as well. But the key thing is use the data in the role. So use it contextually to make the decisions in your actual role. And one of the issues I see going back to the net zero targets is that we're very good as a species at avoiding a difficult subject if we think it's too hard. So when something like targets are now becoming too hard, people are now trying to push them away and saying it never happened in the first place, don't worry, it's someone else's problem to solve. So if we start change this narrative to actually what we need to be looking at is the efficiency of consumption. So how efficiently can I consume the resources that I'm buying to deliver the application or service? Because actually you can't reduce everything down to zero, but what you can do is consume it in the most efficient and effective way. And part of this then links back to the idea of don't do it in isolation, do it as part of the business case where you focus actually on the monumental amount of money saved as a result of being more sustainable. Because if you were to go to leadership and say, I think we can save 30% of our operating budget in IT, I'm sure they'd be relatively interested in having that conversation about it. And then you could tie that into, actually, it's by operating in a more sustainable manner. It's about designing things to be sustainable by design. Because actually, the big thing that we always do in this subject is we obsess about saving the waste that's already happened, And we don't look at preventing the waste before it's going to happen in the first place. So a lot of this is pushing this upstream, which is, again, the kind of work that Ned has been doing with the teams, is the greener service principles, that kind of thing. Because if you can make the better decision before you built it, guess what happens? It's more optimized, better run, more efficient before you've even deployed it, which means in production, you're going to save an absolute fortune because it's going to be sustainable by design. And that's how you tie it all together, and that's how you affect people's roles. And the point being is, people can't change if you can't tell them what they need to change. If they don't know where they're going to change. And a lot of this is also building the long tail. So the next generation of people coming through are the ones who are going to be building, delivering and operating the services going forward. So they need to be trained with these principles from the very start of their introduction into the organisation. So we're looking 5-10 years out then.
I think that's a really good point in terms of the tail on this. We're still using, if anyone's looked at the press, there's been some quite amusing stories from the US of them kind of going in and looking at some of the systems out there and finding that some of the coding goes back to the 50s, 60s. Well, I'm pretty sure that stuff that you are working on now, we are going to be using come 2050 when we're going to be net zero. So the decisions that we make now are absolutely going to echo into the future. So you point about the fantastic work that Ned's been doing around service principles and sustainability and kind of understanding what you're supposed to do and building it in up front. Absolutely crucial. I think the other thing, though, is that we can all take a bit of responsibility and accountability for some of the actions that we undertake. So I think about things like, we'll talk about this a bit later on, I'm sure, but single-use data. Horrifying statistics, 60% of all of the data that goes into the cloud rarely, if ever, gets looked at again. So we're seeing the cloud growing exponentially at the moment. If that carries on, kind of what's the definition of what on earth are we doing here? Is using loads and loads of resources to build data centres to store data that no one's going to look at again. Can't get my head around that. That's something we can all do something about. I mean, we've done some audity type stuff of kind of going in and saying, well, what's the oldest email you've got? What's the oldest document you've got in your hard drive? And some of it's quite kind of a thank you note from like 15 years ago kind of thing. Now, at one level you say, well, okay, how much kind of resources that using? Well, it's a bit like drops of water into a swimming pool. Lots and lots of little drops of water all add up to a ruddy great big swimming pool eventually. So those are the kind of things that we can do, but we need to kind of incentivize people to look at these kind of things.
There is a phrase that stayed with me from when we talked about this issue at Think Data for Government in September, which Ishmael mentioned, which was data is the new plastic, which gets to that single use and I think some of the environmental concerns about material usage really well as well. We'll come to the audience for too long, so please do think about your questions and you can submit them using Slido. The code is on the screen, so please do get your questions flowing. Lots for us to dig into. Something that you've mentioned quite a few times, and I know we'll be talking about it through the day as well, is the importance of measurement, monitoring, metrics. You've used quite a few very powerful stats. We've thought about how we get people thinking about future-proofing a lot of what they're doing. What should we be doing around measurement and metrics? What are the things that we should be reporting on, measuring, and how should we do it?
Step one is don't measure with bad data. And bad data is not just the data that you get from suppliers, it's actually even internally. What we find very often is if you talk about the physicality of things before you even go into the absolute feral nature of the cloud providers and how some things are reported there. But if you look at the infrastructure internally, so in use devices, it's understanding what do you actually have? What do you have? Where is it? And how many of these things do you actually have in production, in test, in development, and scattered across the place? Because we find there's a real lack of understanding of the sheer number of assets that are out there when you start looking at everything from desktops, tablets, mobile phones, monitors, the spiraling mess of every single thing that has been purchased to deliver the services that are required. When you actually realise how many, you find there are millions of devices not being accounted for. So actually, it's not just the data points for the kind of the scope 3 metrics, the scope 2 power metrics. It's actually, you need to know how many of the things you've got in the first place to make sure you're counting the problem properly so you can understand the impact of the decisions you're going to make. Getting your data into a shape where it's not just for reporting. Reporting is really important because it gives the overall scale of the picture, and that needs to be aligned. But you need to get this data into a shape that's totally different, which is how do you use the data to shape different decisions? And that requires a completely different structure, process, and approach where it needs to be much more granular. And every single category of device of type, so The metrics you'll need for end user devices will be very different to the metrics you need for core data center infrastructure, which will be different to the metrics you need from the cloud. The outcomes might be the same, but you need different data because otherwise you can't make different decisions about how you're going to procure, design, and operate any of those.
What he said. I mean, the only thing I would say on top of that is, and I've seen this in the private sector, is that we've kind of got into a bit of a hunting for perfection on the data. So if you think about a number of 3.45678, we've been fixating on the, is it 89 or is it 78 at the end of it, rather than it's actually a really great big number at the start of it. Can we actually do something about it? It's kind of knowing when the data is good enough for us to actually take some action on it, and kind of, yes, that's not saying that we don't go back and revisit it, but finding that kind of Goldilocks spot where the data's not too cold and not too hot and is actionable is absolutely at the core of this for me.
And apart from that, and I absolutely agree, which is because the paralysis bit is really, really present in front of everyone, but it's also that link back to the efficiency, because it's not just the totality. It's like, now know what the number is. How efficiently are we consuming that number? And that's where the opportunities to reduce, so the levers you can pull to make different decisions. And that's where the accountability part comes in, which is you need to help people understand what things are they actually accountable for in their role that will influence the size and scale of this. So you push the accountability to where it actually sits. And that can make for some really awkward conversations with leadership, because actually a huge amount of these decisions sit at that level. It's the policy, the standards, the governance. And actually they might not want to hear that, because that's the things they can directly influence and change.
Great, thank you. I'm going to come to the audience now for questions. So again, tell us who you are and where you're from. Wait for the microphone to come to you. You can use Slido as well. Who would like to ask the first question?
Tom Devlin, DWP. Steve, you mentioned about the person with the email, with the 15-year-old email. How do you incentivize people to actually delete those emails so it's not filling up the swimming pool?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think big fan of the best way to kind of consume an elephant is one chunk at a time. So kind of see people talk about, I'm going to spend kind of my whole day kind of going through my inbox. I think the reality is do it in chunks and maybe make it fun. So some of the stuff that I was doing in a previous life when I was working in financial services, we had competitions, kind of who can find the oldest email, and can we kind of get rid of it, or who's got the biggest OneDrive inbox, and have a competition for seeing how much stuff that we can get rid of. The other bit, coming back to the point that Mark talked about, is having good habits to begin with. So kind of, if I use one of my rubbish analogies, there's one thing to empty the bathtub of all of the stuff that you've got in there that you built up over years, but the other bit is turning the tap off. So one of the things trying to encourage is good data habits right now. So kind of making sure that you're getting rid of those emails that you don't need, making sure that you're getting rid of versions of documents that you don't need. Yes, you have to have an audit trail, not saying let's get rid of stuff that you don't need, but if it's taking you 25 versions of a document to get to the one that you're using, how many of us go back and get rid of those 24 versions that didn't quite pass muster before you get to the one that you're actually using?
And if you want a contextual example of this in practice, so there's an organisation in financial services that we're working with. The outcome of this, so I'll give you the answer of what they've decided to do, and it's going to be painful for British people here. It's be more rude. That's basically what they have now decided, because what they found was, so they did an assessment working with Microsoft of their email and long-term retention. And so a large organisation, and they found 1.6 billion emails in their repository, which has been kept forever, which were simply thanks. It was thanks, no problem, that kind of stuff. And so they now have a policy in place where they're saying the policy is, actually, you agree with it when received unless you comment back with, I don't agree for these reasons. So everyone is grateful. And the outcome of that is, you think of that, billions of emails now being saved, and that is processing power, data storage, network transit, huge amounts of compute, and also actually people's time, because time has a currency in sustainability as well. So actually, by being more rude, we could actually end up saving the planet.
That's a great T-shirt slogan, if ever there was one. Let's take another question from the audience. We've got one just there.
Harry Mitchell from Deloitte, and I'm working on the Synergy shared services implementation that Tom mentioned earlier. I think one thing that's really interesting from what you've shared is that sort of divorce between the reporting and targets and actually the operational decision making. And I was just wondering if you could share any best practices or sort of case studies that you're aware of where you've actually seen data and insights being surfaced related to sustainability that have really shaped operational decision making and the decisions people are making on a daily basis.
Okay, so I'm not going to spoil the one from later, but there's one example I have from financial services here, which is, so with accurate granular data analysis of their public cloud and private cloud environments, they established very quickly they had one service class where everything was treated with the same platinum class of service because they were special. They were a special bank making lots of money, so therefore it wasn't a problem to spend billions on IT. What we found was 70% of their environments were test and dev environments being treated with a 24/7 availability level, everything replicated across every place you possibly could. We also found that their infrastructure teams weren't talking to development teams at all. So they had the most resilient at an infrastructure layer, everything replicated, everything resilient, everything in different data centers. Their application team then wisely ignored all of that and built all applications to be resilient by design at the top layer, using things like Oracle HA, that kind of stuff. So what that meant was their average CPU utilization on their private cloud was 4.7%. Yet they were still buying thousands of compute nodes every single year, because they needed it to support the capacity. And part of that also linked into once a month, they peaked to 48%. Once a month for 1 hour. And that became their design metric for the level at which they had to deploy the services based upon, because they never go above 50% because of resilience again. Funnily enough, by changing their attitude to actually dev and test can go down any time. It's an irrelevant service class, no one cares. Production is sacrosanct, can't be touched, so that's like the 30% that's left, absolutely treated in the same way. They halved the size of that as a result of understanding they need to talk to each other on that side. On the dev and test side, they've saved £380 million so far. And the sustainability impact has been monumentally huge because they're now moving those from scattered data centers across the world, consolidated into smaller locations, which are now in the more sustainable regions. So they're making that operating condition because the data contained in those platforms is not needed to be protected. There's no security and governance on it because it's non-identifiable data for the test and dev platforms. So they've made those decisions and they have globally consolidated platforms in fewer data centers consuming less services.
Yeah, what he said again. Two things. One is Deloitte, fantastic work that you're doing on some of your papers. I know I quoted one of them earlier on. I'd absolutely recommend having a look at some of the reports that they produced back end of 2024 on sustainability in business. Very good stuff. The other example I was going to call on was the how organisations use your, in AWS terms, free storage. Yeah, so in a lot of cases, organisations are tending to focus on using the one that gives you the lowest latency, the kind of highest response rate. And when you actually go in and look at the information that's been stored there, it falls into the 60% bucket of rarely if ever touched. So why can't we start moving some of that stuff to some of the S3 Glacier storage, where in actual fact that stuff can kind of sit there on tape. Yes, you can get hold of it quite quickly still, but kind of do you actually need to have it at somebody's fingertips so that they can find, 15 years ago I had this email that said thanks on it. I really now in like 2 seconds need to understand where that email is and who it was from. And the answer is no, I probably don't. So we need to be more curious, I guess, about the services and the data storage that we've got and kind of challenge ourselves to do better.
Thank you. I think something that we talked about before today's panel was we often just don't think about that at all. And cloud storage just feels like it's endless. And therefore we don't actually need to have these conversations because there's just going to be plenty of space to put it.
Yeah, we need to stop thinking that it's someone else's problem.
Yeah. And I think, we'll talk a bit about this in one of the panels later on, but I think we need to shift our mindset a bit away from an abundance of everything to the reality is that these are quite scarce resources and we need to take better care of them.
We've got time for a few more audience questions. So who would like to go next? We've got one just there.
Akin Tinimo from Cabinet Office. Do you think we need to have a look or review our data retention period that we currently have in digital space? People are keeping digital information for 7 years. before it's been deleted. To me, they're just too long in the Twitter space.
Short answer, yes. Slightly longer answer is yes, but we need to understand the behavioural economics behind it. So quite often what we're seeing is people keeping information because they are absolutely worried that if they don't keep the information and in 5 years' time somebody second-guesses a decision that might have been made 5 years ago, they need to have the evidence behind it. And there's the other bit, which is people are inherently lazy about stuff like this. Who comes into the office and they come into the office, go home and speak to their family, say, what did you do today, Steve? Yeah, I spent 3 hours going through my inbox, getting rid of loads of thank you. It's not exactly woohoo. I came to work to do that today, which is why I think we need to kind of make it a bit more fun, and we need to do it in chunks. But but fundamentally, I think we need to help colleagues to feel more comfortable with kind of deleting stuff. I think I read something that psychologically, as a species, we are pre-programmed to be hunter-gatherers. It's against our nature to give stuff up. Yeah. So we're fighting a bit against this. We've got to help colleagues. And some of that comes down to rules, and some of that comes down to kind of maybe changing some of the culture and behaviour around storing bits and pieces. Makes sense.
Also, if you focus on changing the culture at the start, it's not worrying about changing what's already happened. Because sometimes the cost and complexity of changing what's already happened is put something on the too hard pile. But if you could address, going back to my point about just stop people saying thank you, actually it stops the future problem from growing. And then you may have time to focus on the legacy problem, but actually it's a future problem we need to be addressing here.
I was just wondering, I think sometimes relying on people to make individual behaviour changes that often, like in the case of emails, rely on a large time investment in an environment where everyone's quite always, that they don't always get the buy-in of the whole organisation. Have you seen any really good examples of tools that can be helped for this kind of thing? I know, for example, I always get advertised like tools that clean up our photos, that delete duplicates. Have you seen that for email or other data tools that we could employ across government to help this problem?
Yes, I have. Certainly in financial services, there's some of that tooling used. I was at Civil Service Live last year, where might have actually been Cabinet Office, funnily enough. We're talking about a project that they were doing using AI to go through their kind of storage to look for, using that kind of technology to look for duplicates or kind of documentation that perhaps we could get rid of now. So my own view is that this is something that I think is going to grow. I think that this is something that organisations and kind of fintechs are going to start to kind of plug a gap in the market using AI, potentially kind of green use of AI. Fantastic. Who saw that coming?
So tech loves a tool. Obviously, being old in IT means that you've seen these trends come and go. If you go back, there was information lifecycle management was the buzzword of the early 2000s. SRM, storage resource management, everyone talked about that. Everyone talked about it, no one did it. It was really complicated and expensive and difficult, and then that's when compliance came along with the need to retain everything forever. So it went from it's too hard to do it to let's just keep it forever and solve the problem. And now we're seeing in the private sector, some organisations are actually taking the other end of the spectrum and going, we're going to delete everything because you can't hold us accountable if we never had it in the first place. But the big part of this is don't obsess about those kind of things too much, because if you look at all the levers you could pull across the whole of IT, that's actually probably one of the more complicated and smaller ones in terms of the likely overall reductions. If you just did something as simple as operating more efficiently in the design and build of platforms and services and how they're consumed, you're likely to get bigger traction in terms of the financial return back into the organisation. You start getting that traction within the sustainability initiatives, what you end up with is getting the ear of leadership. And if you get the ear of leadership, that buys you the time, the budget and ability to do some of the harder tasks that you need to come on to. Because something like the whole data side thing is really important, and I wouldn't say ignore it at all. But if you obsess too much of it at the start, it becomes, that's just a really difficult thing, and the return's going to be hard. It's going to cost us a load of time and money to invest in it. And what money are we going to get back? And you say, well, actually, it's not going to break even. Compared to if you went to, say, your cloud investment and said, we can reduce our cloud spend immediately by 30% by operating in this way. That will deliver us back another 20 million, 30 million, 50 million, 100 million back into the organisation. That's going to get the ear of people who then enable you to build the capability, to build the team and to build the mandate inside the organisation to deliver the change.
Great. I think that's absolutely true. The one thing I would say on top of that is getting colleagues involved in doing stuff around sustainability that is more than just, I put my Coke can in recycling. helps to build that kind of cultural change. It helps to get colleagues feeling part of the solution. Whereas some of the more strategic decisions, it can feel a little bit nebulous. So there's something to be said for kind of combining all of these things as part of a wider organisational initiative to get the organisation pivoting towards digital sustainability and making sure everyone feels part of it.
Thanks. To bring this discussion to a close, one sentence from each of you, one action that we should take away based on what you've told us this morning.
Be curious. Simple as that.
Be rude. Hold your leaders accountable.
Brilliant. Well, Steve and Mark, thank you very much indeed.